Yeah, it's a bent lamination office chair. So yeah, I built an office chair for my entry into the Rocklerbentwoodchallenge, which is being put on by the guys from the Modern Maker podcast. I participated last year in their one sheet of plywood challenge and had tons of fun connecting with the community and building another chair. I'll link that video above so you can check that out if you like. Now, all you've seen me do so far is really just get materials ready for building my forms. The form I made for the backrest of the chair, I probably did a little bit differently, and I'll show you a better way to do this later on, but I doubled up my plywood before cutting out my shape, which I still was able to get the same result. However, there was a couple more steps involved. And I actually had to use scraps of plywood to boost up my template so I could trace the inside of the form. I'll show you later how much easier it is to do this when you only have one layer of plywood to start out with. Now keep in mind, you could use something as simple as a jigsaw to cut these lines, but I found that a combination of my track saw and my bandsaw gave me the best results. This is what I mean about using one sheet of plywood. It's so much easier to cut these templates out when you just have one piece of plywood to worry about and then coming back after the fact and doubling it up.
Now we know. And knowing is half the battle.
So I worked pretty consistently for about a month on this chair, and the first week or so of the project, we're basically just making forms. So I'll link the video above to the bar stools that I made last year, where I did the same method of lining the forms with cork in order to help even out gluing pressure. And this is something I learned from Mark Spagnola, the Wood Whisperer, in a video that he did specifically about doing bent lamination. So that video will be below as well if you want to check out a little bit more in-depth way or explanation of how to make these forms. I just used a flexible tape measure to measure the inside of all my frames, so I knew how long to cut the rough material for my maple strips that I had to mill up to make my bent lamination pieces. In total, there was well over 60 strips of maple that I had to cut for this project. If this is your first time visiting my channel, I really want to say thanks for checking out the work that I'm doing. I would super appreciate it if you'd hit that subscribe button and then hit that bell so you get all the notifications when my new videos come out. It's been great having my son at the age where he can actually help me with projects like this, but I did realize the next day that a bucket was doing the same job that he was. However, when it came to clamping up the bent lamination in the forms, it was amazing having an extra set of hands. How I do bent lamination is I'll soak my strips in hot water for about an hour so they're pliable enough that I can cinch them up into my forms. I'll leave them at least for a day just drying in the form, and I'll come back once they're dry enough and I'll clamp everything back together and usually leave it for at least 24 to 48 hours. So I'm just at that point in the process where I have my bent lamination pieces mostly done for the top, but now I have to start working on the seat base and the seat back. So I got this vacuum bag. I've seen a couple of guys use this online. I'll put a link in the description to the one that I'm using. And this is just a way that I can make a vacuum form to be able to bend what will be the seat base. So I use this as an opportunity to learn a little bit more about Fusion 360. And I was able to actually build my form straight in Fusion and then export the G-code with their CAM software. There's some great tutorials on how to do this, and I probably could have done a few things differently, but being that it was my first attempt, it worked really well. This form was used to sculpt the seat, the back of the seat, as well as the cross supports for the back of the seat and for the seat base. And again, I did line it with cork just to help even out the gluing pressure when I put the form and the veneers into the vacuum bag. Have you ever heard of aircraft plywood? I sure hadn't, and this was 1/16 of an inch thick plywood that worked amazingly well to sandwich in between my two walnut veneers to build the seat base as well as the seat back. Now this is something that I tried for the first time, but I made a zero clearance plate for my bandsaw, so when I was cutting the walnut veneer, it didn't slide underneath the fence, and also there wasn't a gap in front of or behind the blade. From there, it was super easy just to cut my veneers to the rough shape so I could put everything into the vacuum bag. Now, admittedly, this was a fairly stressful glue up, so I did leave everything in the vacuum bag for more time that was required. I didn't want to have to repurchase these materials a second time, so I left it for an extended period just to make sure that all the glue cured in just the right way. Once we sucked all the air out of the vacuum press, we left it for about 20 minutes and came back and just to make sure that it was holding a vacuum.
One debt to society later.
This was a really neat process, and it was cool after about 24 hours just how firm all the pieces were after the glue had fully cured. Now, I did make my pieces just oversized. That way I could go back at the table saw and cut everything down to final width and final length. I wish I could tell you that this project was brought to you by glue, because I probably used 3/4 of a gallon of glue to finish this project. Now what I'm doing here is gluing up the strips for the under supports of the seat. It might be hard to tell, but I actually put the seat base back into the bag to act as an additional form to help shape the undersides of the seats to the correct shape. I should have spaced my parts out more because I did glue them all together, but I was able to clean those up with the bandsaw and the table saw. It took some finagling, but I had to cut a very odd angle on the under supports so they'd match up properly with the side supports, and I had to set my domino to, I believe it was 87 degrees to be able to line up the dominoes to the 90 degree, which was on the side supports of the seat. I was finally getting close to assembly, so I started sanding the sides and the armrests of the seat. The opposing dominoes on the seat sides were pretty easy to do. I did a dry assembly of my side supports as well as the seat bases, so I'd be able to mark out where to add my half flaps to attach the armrests. This was another super funny angle, so I basically had to use a level on the top of the armrest and a tape measure to figure out what angle I actually needed to come up with, which was, I believe, around 42 degrees. I was finally getting to the point where I could actually glue pieces together and not just the strips of maple. So I did a round over on all of my pieces just because I figured it'd be easier to get at these before it was assembled. And I also waited till my glue was dry before cutting off the end piece of the half flap of the armrest. By this point, I was about 3 weeks in, so I had no qualms with using dominoes for joinery. Obviously, you could use something like a doweling jig or even pocket screws, but I had just put so much time into this. To this point, I wasn't going to get any more complicated with how I was going to join the cross supports to the side supports. So this was really, other than the wheels, the only part of the chair that was not wood. I took this hydraulic lift out of an old office chair that we had that the base was just destroyed on, and I wrapped this in a maple veneer just to give it that look of it actually being wood. And this turned out really well, so I'm glad I took this extra step to camouflage the hydraulic lift I was using. Attaching it was pretty easy. I just used CA glue and ran a bead, sprayed some activator, and I just kept working my way around, and then I trimmed everything to final length. Moving on, I started cutting out what would become the hub and the legs of the chair. The hub was a pentagon, and each of the legs were attached with sliding dovetails. To keep things safe, I did make one long strip, which was then cut into 5 smaller pieces to make up the pentagon shape of the hub. And as always, I used the fence on my table saw as a straight edge so I'm able to line up the green tape and assemble everything as evenly as possible. I cut out little sliding dovetail keys, which I added to what would become the top half of the hub. Now, this was done for 2 reasons. One, because when I was routing, I wanted to make sure my bearing had something to ride against, but more importantly, it also acted as a stop point for the sliding dovetail of the legs. I added a bevel on the bottom, and you'll see later that I rounded off the top half of the hub. I added this little plug to the bottom so I'd be able to shoot brad nails through just to add a little bit more support to this base, because I spent so much time on this, probably the majority of a weekend. I did not want to remake it. But spoiler alert, I had to remake it. I added a small roundover to the top half of all my hopes and dreams, and moved on to working on the legs, which were cut at a 15-degree angle for the base of the chair. I also added a slight taper to the top half of the leg just so it didn't feel so thick. This is when everyone's going to comment that I'm cutting these sliding dovetails on the back side of the bit, which means that I'm pushing the material in the same direction that the bit is moving. And you're 100% right, and I 100% should not have done it this way. I didn't actually realize this till I was done and moving on to the next step. I made a little drilling jig so I could add the holes for the wheels perfectly level over at the drill press, and then I moved on to assembling the hub and the legs of the base.
What time?
That's correct.
The base or the shaft?
The base, correct.
Gentlemen, we can rebuild him. We have the technology.
Here's the differences in version 2.0. I added splines to the top and bottom of the hub. I used 8/4 material and drilled a 2-inch hole through the middle to receive the seat post. And I also added the same dovetail keys to the bottom as well as the top, effectively sandwiching the leg in between the 2 layers. And it worked. With the new base built, I was ready for final assembly, so I glued the seat base and the seat back onto the frame of the chair. I made a last-minute decision as well to build a walnut accent piece for the armrest. It felt pretty chunky just having it sit directly on top of the armrest, so I used my dado blade to cut out a channel so it fit over top of the maple armrest. With everything assembled and final sanding complete, I was able to start finishing my bent lamination office chair. And of course I had to use Maker Brand Simple Finish on this one. It's amazing how a project like this bent lamination office chair can really come to life as soon as you start adding finish. With the finish dry, I added the wheels, which I found these awesome rollerblade style office chair wheels on Amazon, which I just had to get. I put a poll on my Instagram, and this is the one that by far won the most votes. And if you're looking to see more of the behind the scenes, feel free to follow me on Instagram. This was a dream of mine to make this chair for about 1.5 years, and it took the guys from the Modern Maker podcast doing this bent lamination challenge to give me the right motivation to put this chair together. And you know what? It truly came out better than I could have imagined. Now, unfortunately, with our new office that we just moved into, this chair does not match the decor. but it's going to have a permanent place in our home office so our kids have a nice chair to sit in and watch YouTube videos about playing Fortnite. Again, if you like this build, I'd love to see you hit that thumbs up button. And if there's any questions that you have about this build, I'd love to answer those in the comments below. Here's a couple other videos that you might want to check out. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you on the next build.